The holiest site in ancient Greece was the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, the home of the Delphic oracle. A set of 150 maxims was inscribed on or in the immediate vicinity of the temple at least as early as the 5th century BCE. 3 of them were right at the entrance, and the first and most famous was Gnoti se auton, which translates as know thyself. Now, the phrase originally meant something like know your limitations, that is, know your place in the universe, or even remember that you are mortal. But by Plato's day, 100 years later, it had acquired the meaning that we think of today, know your soul. So now it's about deep self-knowledge. Now, this particular quest wasn't only a Greek concern. The Hebrew prophets had been wrestling with the same issue for several centuries before Plato. Look at Isaiah 53:11, which is usually translated, "By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous." Years ago, I read a book called Messengers of God, which was written by Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate, Elie Wiesel. His book showed me that there can be more than one way to read the Hebrew text, and that this can have a profound impact on the meaning of a passage. In the standard English translations of Genesis 4, Cain responds to God's question about his brother Abel's whereabouts by saying, "I know not, am I my brother's keeper?" But Wiesel points out that you could also read the Hebrew as a defensive, "I didn't know I was supposed to be my brother's keeper." Even a slight change in tone brings a completely different nuance to the story. We see the same effect in Isaiah. You could read Isaiah 53:11 as saying, "By the knowledge of himself shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous." And in fact, a few English Bible translations, most notably the American Standard Version of 1901, render the verse that exact same way. Which leaves us with 3 main interpretive possibilities for it. The first possibility is, "By other people's knowledge of him shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous." This lines up with the penal substitution theories of the atonement, where God makes Jesus a blood sacrifice in order to wash away human sin. Much traditional and conventional Christian theology is built on this idea, although many people, Quakers and others, are uncomfortable with it. The second possibility is, "By the servant's own knowledge of something extrinsic shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous." This interpretation is classically Jewish. The nations see something about the Jewish people which draws them toward the true God. Perhaps this is the Torah, or maybe it's the knowledge of how to please God. Or maybe the nations finally realize that they've treated the Jewish people unjustly, and this softens their consciences and helps them to understand that the Jews were innocent all along, which is very relevant in terms of the Holocaust. The early 12th century Spanish rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra interpreted the line about the servant bearing the iniquities of the many as the servant enduring the suffering inflicted on Israel by the cruelty of the other nations. A generation earlier, on the other hand, the French rabbi usually called Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Isaac, thought it was the servant's inner knowledge that drew others to the true God. The third interpretation uses a rabbinical theological stance called Hineni. That's Hineni, Hineni. The Hebrew word literally means, "Here am I." This was Abraham's response when the angel of the Lord stopped him from offering his son Isaac as a human sacrifice. Moses said it at the burning bush. And when Isaiah of Jerusalem saw God filling the temple, he used the same word. Hineni is an act of profound self-knowledge, of presenting your whole self to God. It's a way of saying that you're totally available to God's presence. You know, the way we Quakers are supposed to behave in the silence. One way of doing this is to read yourself into the text, and everybody does it. Famous Jewish example is that during the Passover Seder, you're supposed to imagine that the story is taking place in the present and that you're one of the slaves in Egypt. In American history, perhaps the most famous example is the slaves reading themselves into the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Their descendants continue to see the story the same way over 160 years after emancipation. If you apply this technique to Isaiah 53:11, you get, "By knowledge of himself shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous." That was closer to the tack I took during my time in York, but to understand my experiences over there, you should first hear a bit about how I grew up. When I was young, my Quaker meeting, Kernersville Friends, was very programmed. Not as programmed as some I've been in, but it was still pretty programmed. Carolyn has told us the story how she took the young friends of this meeting around to different churches so that they could experience different forms of worship. She wanted them to visit a church that gave an altar call, but she couldn't seem to find one. Then she took them to Kernersville, and would you believe it? That's where she found an altar call. Go figure. We were usually lucky to get 2 minutes of quiet at Kernersville. More than that, and people started fidgeting, shifting in their pews, or rattling their bulletins. Believe me when I tell you that there are few things as loud as an unembraced silence. When I went to Guilford College, I was exposed to a much broader spectrum of Quakerism. I went to the unprogrammed meeting on campus very early on, but I wasn't yet ready for that much silence. Since I only lived half an hour away, I often went home for the weekend. When I did stay on campus, I usually ended up going to a nearby programmed meeting. My old pastor was serving there now, and I was used to that style of worship, so I stuck to what I knew. And all the while, I kept experiencing different expressions of Quakerism. Pete Moore's Quakerism class helped me broaden my horizons. I also took a course with a visiting British educator named Charity James, who taught us about concentric circle listening. Have you heard about this? Okay. First, you listen to the noises outside the room. Then you listen to the noises inside the room. And finally, you listen to the sounds inside your own body. If you get really good at it, you're supposed to be able to hear your own heartbeat. Guess what? I was never that good at it. So when I went to the university in the ancient English city of York to do a year of graduate work in medieval studies, I attended the Quaker meeting in Friargate, which is a street near Clifford's Tower. I was unprepared for the total immersion in the traditional unprogrammed worship that they had in England, and which is still the majority over there. I remembered Charity James's lessons on concentric circle listening, but it also didn't take me long to realize that would only get me so far. So I added a next step. Quakerism trains you to listen for God. So I began searching out and listening to my major emotions. I decided that I could think of 5 of them. And the way I remembered them was this: glad, sad, mad, scared, hurt. That's the best way to tell God's voice apart from our own inner noise. According to Howard Britton's book on the early Quaker journals, it's also remarkably similar to the process of spiritual development that the early friends went through. What I was doing was to give those emotions permission to express themselves. This took a number of weeks, and it was intense. Sometimes it was very intense. One Sunday morning, an elder of the meeting at the Rise of Worship asked me if everything was all right. I reassured him that I was just doing some necessary work. That inner labor is the classical Quaker spiritual exercise. It was one of the reasons friends started quaking in the old days. Quaker silence isn't therapy, of course, but it can be quite therapeutic. It's hineni in action. Eventually, I realized that I was having my own hineni experience, even though I didn't yet have a name for it. A passage in Isaiah, chapter 50, verses 4 through 9, became very precious to me because it matched what was happening in my soul during those Sunday mornings in York. Bible scholars call this passage, Judith knows, the third servant song of 4.
Oh.
Yeah. It comes from the second part of Isaiah, which was written by an unknown author toward the end of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. Traditional Christian interpretations, as old as the New Testament Gospels and the book of Acts, focus on Jesus as the servant because the 4th servant song in Isaiah 53 describes a figure who is apparently killed and rises again. The original author, however, probably intended the servant to be a way of describing Israel's exile and impending restoration. I'm convinced that the anonymous prophet from 2,500 years ago was a woman. The maternal imagery for God is very strong in those chapters, stronger than anywhere else, as it turns out. Among other things, God pants and cries out like a woman in labor, chapter 42, and is compared to a breastfeeding mother, chapter 49. But one passage in particular spoke directly to my condition. The Lord God has given me the tongue of those who are taught, that I may know how to sustain with the word him that is weary. Morning by morning he wakens my ear to hear as those who are taught. The Lord God has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious, I turned not backward. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to those who pulled out the beard. I hid not my face from shame and spitting, for the Lord God helps me. Therefore I have not been confounded. Therefore I have set my face like a flint, and I know that I shall not be put to shame. He who vindicates me is near. Who will contend with me? Let us stand up together. Who is my adversary? Let him come near to me. Behold, the Lord God helps me. Who will declare me guilty? Behold, all of them will wear out like a garment. The moth will eat them up. The servant has clearly received some really rough treatment. They beat him up, they spit on him, and to make matters worse, they start pulling hairs out of his beard. Now, this last part wasn't just physically painful and cruel, it was also a deadly insult. In 2 Samuel 10, King David sends emissaries to offer condolences to the new king of the Ammonites after the death of his father, who had been David's friend. But the new king's advisors falsely claim that David's messengers are really spies, So he orders that they be humiliated by having one side of their beards shaved off. And that's why David starts a war with the Ammonites. You might say David reacts badly to humiliation. He summons a woman named Bathsheba to his palace for a non-consensual affair. I mean, let's face it, how much choice did she really have in the matter? And then he finds out that she's pregnant by him. So David covers up his misdeeds by arranging the battlefield murder of her husband, Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was one of David's loyal soldiers away fighting in the war. In other words, David responds to humiliation by starting a war and then committing a double act of violence which destroys an innocent family. It's no wonder that the prophet Nathan pays him a little visit to convey God's displeasure with the way David has been acting. That brings us back to 2 Isaiah. The servant is systematically brutalized, humiliated, and stripped of his humanity, but his response is different from David's. The pivot point comes in Isaiah 50, verse 7. For the Lord God helps me. Therefore I have not been confounded. Therefore I have set my face as a flint, and I know that I shall not be put to shame. He who vindicates me is near. The servant's response to humiliation is essentially the same as his apparent resurrection in chapter 53. He takes the very worst they have to offer and comes through on the other side. And in a smaller personal way, that's what happened to me in York. Not only did I face down my inner voices, I actively hunted them down and broke through to the other side. If you read Isaiah 53:11 as the servant making many to be accounted righteous by his knowledge of himself, then the third servant song in Isaiah 50 is how that process plays out in our individual lives. We take a moral inventory of ourselves, fearless, unflinching, and repeated until we come to know ourselves. And that's how we come to know the difference between the voice of God and our own inner noise. Quakerism traditionally values spiritual honesty. So our central testimony is integrity. You might call it our founding testimony, our root testimony. And we're not the only ones to see the value of radical spiritual honesty. The 12-step programs are built on the very same foundation. But for the people on that path, it's not just a matter of theology. It's a matter of survival. Step 4 talks about making a searching moral inventory of ourselves. Boy, that sounds familiar. And step 10 talks about making this moral inventory an ongoing process. And when we're in the wrong, promptly admitting it. This exact brand of radical moral inventory is the only real way forward for our country right now. The divisions in our society today are probably deeper than at any time since the 1960s. We've only partially acknowledged the darker moments of our past. For instance, slavery was horrific and it was evil. There's more than enough blame to go around when it comes to that particular dance of abomination. But I won't call slavery a genocide, lest I cheapen that term. Not every brutal and oppressive situation qualifies as a genocide. What I would call a genocide is what happened to the people who were already living here when the first European explorers and settlers showed up. Apart from a few brief shining moments, such as the treaty between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, or the one between William Penn and the Lenape, most of American history has been one long trail of tears for them. Entire peoples have been exiled from their homelands. Some have even been wiped out completely. But we can't allow any one side to have the final word on the subject. Some people feel that the national narrative is being taken away from them, and that their ancestors are being painted as unmitigated villains. The truth is, almost never is anybody an unmitigated anything. We have to acknowledge the way they feel. While striving to include people in our story, we can't push out those who are already there. If we do, we won't have any peace, and we won't heal. We have to ensure that nobody is undervalued, that everybody feels wanted, and that's far from being an easy task. The past century should have taught us that lesson, if nothing else. Yet we can't set our face like flint to build a just and more righteous future if we refuse to take a long and honest look at the truth of our past. True integrity and our spiritual survival demand that we sit together in the silence. We must do the necessary work of a fearless and national moral inventory. But while we're searching for a just way forward, we need to remember that the mere transfer of privilege from one group to a new elite is not equality. We need to be about the business of abolishing the privilege, either by extending it to everybody or by doing away with it entirely. There is no middle ground. By choosing to look honestly and unflinchingly into the recesses of our own collective soul, we can totally transform our next 250 years. And we can finally begin to heed those ancient Greek words of wisdom. Know thyself.